Alright, hi everyone, welcome to the semifinals of WhoopId. Congratulations to all teams for making it this far. Alright, my name is Amira, I'm chairing this round. Judging with me is Jess Muslin and Rob Berry. I remind the audience to keep your cheering and jeering to a minimum. In fact, just don't have them at all, that'd be great. If you need to leave the room, please do so in between speeches. If you need to come back, there is a glass through the floor, there is something you can see through. If somebody's speaking, don't come in. Alright, without further ado, silence your phones or off them. I now invite the Prime Minister.
I think social narratives in this case need to be shaped to adhere to certain benefits of having more inclusiveness, of having female perception within political discourse. But first on the nature of female politicians and how upbringing contributes to that. There are a lot of hidden narratives in the lives of women across the world, right? I mean, if you're a woman, more often than not, when you walk into the room, physically, you are much weaker than everyone else. It's something that doesn't cross the mind of many males, for example. When they approach a woman, a lot of times it is intimidating. A lot of times that physical power dynamic is something that a lot of people worry about. But what it does is it shapes the mind of women to be more adaptable. They're more willing to compromise. They're more willing to fight for stances and push for soft policy versus engaging in active conflict. We think that it's really important that this social narrative is forwarded because it influences a lot of things such as the upbringing of families. You see, a lot of times women don't necessarily go towards political science courses. The nature of it because they feel like they do not have hope in these political courses. They are less likely to succeed. But we live in a world whereby conflict is ever increasing. We live in a world whereby the amount of cooperation within political parties are things that are not necessarily being forwarded. We see government shutdowns in the United States. We see more and more governments across the world being engaged in active conflict versus conflict mediation. We believe that women are the answer in these circumstances. We believe that they should be included in political discourse. We give them the hope to try for these political things. We give them the capacity or the motivation to contribute towards solving a problem in society. All right, closing.
So is your team stance that you think that this social narrative is true, therefore why you support it?
Our team stance is that there's a current weakness within social narratives that exists in status quo. More often than not, the image of a politician is attached to that of a male politician giving some kind of policy. We believe that the nature of having more people to solve this problem, like more individuals to solve the problem, because of the amount of competition that will exist under status quo, right? The ability of women to participate in political discourse means that you raise the standards of inclusiveness within politics. The reason being, to actually pass policy more often requires a certain amount of agreement within the House. It means that you have to persuade people to vote for certain policies, right? Certain parliamentarians to vote for policies. We believe that it's really important to have this standard of inclusiveness because women see certain interests that more often not men miss. We believe that there is an untapped potential in this debate. But the problem in society is that the social narrative often pushes to men for these fields. Even things that are fringe are remotely related to politics, such as lawyers, for example. More often than not, men are pushed towards these things. But it's important to dissect the motivations of going for a cause. A lot of times, even within conservative families, right, women are not sent for certain levels of education because there is this dominant narrative that a role of a woman is to raise a family. There is no point in investing a huge amount of financial capital to actually send these people for an education. I believe that given conflict is something that's ever growing within status quo, people see an importance to solve conflict, and people are going to send women to education or sectors of education that are related to politics and related to political science in general, if they see them as a means to solve problems in society. We believe that we increase the motivation to send women towards political science courses. We believe that it's something that society will benefit immediately from. We believe that policy should be inclusive in this regard. Right, closing.
Given that political science majors right now in universities have 60% representation of women, and international relations majors, which is even more conflict-driven, has 80% representation of women, why do you think that is a problem that women are not going into these courses with adequate equity?
Well, even if we buy that statistic that you could have made up, a lot of times, even when women go into these political science courses, the nature of it means that they are not being heard. I believe that a lot of times within the realms of political discourse, women are not being heard because of assumptions on their credibility, right? So the problem, even if we were to buy the premise that a lot of women are going for political science courses, the nature of political discourse is more often than not, the credibility of women not being accurately assessed. I believe that under side government, what you get is more inclusive policy making, but also what you get is a higher instance of credibility, whereby society is more likely to view women politicians as people that are extremely credible and capable versus women not being worth the time to listen to. Now, what does this actually create in status quo, improvements to status quo? I believe that eventually what you get is a lot more centrist policies, such as governments that are willing to give and take, for example. We live in a status quo whereby strongman politicians are extremely popular, and these strongman politicians, more often than not, build their support bases on stances such as we won't compromise. We see in Russia, for example, not compromising with the West, or Donald Trump saying America first, we won't compromise with the rest. We believe that we can persuade the public otherwise. In instances such as Angela Merkel, for example, whereby she actively promotes peace. She has the capability to promote certain policies, such as the acceptance of immigrants within Germany. We believe that the nature of it, meaning there are credible women politicians, means that we live in a status quo whereby the achievements of these people need to be highlighted. Now, what have I talked about, right? I've talked about the nature of women in society and how that unique mindset, the ability to compromise versus strongman politicians, is something that's extremely important within status quo. I talk about how it shapes the upbringing within families, why the likelihood of sending women into political science courses increases under our side, because we change the narratives on capabilities of women. But even if women are already in these political courses, it changes the capacity of the public in general to listen to women. People are more likely to listen given that their capacities to make decisions are highlighted, or their political capacities are highlighted more. We believe that there are more individuals to solve the problem by virtue of just competition or inclusiveness of women in political discourse means that a lot of times you're going to have different perspectives, and we believe that policies that are made based on this inclusiveness are going to be better policies ultimately. We believe that a lot of improvements to status quo are going to happen, such as more centrist policies or governments willing to cooperate with one another. For all the reasons above, proud to propose.
All right, thanks, Prime Minister, and I invite you to our opposition. Okay.
The government case today rests around a very simple premise that unfortunately they spent very little time proving. Namely, that if you introduce this narrative around women, we will get more women into politics. I'm going to explain my first point why that is not true, and give you lots of reasons to believe that actually this narrative is actively harmful within the kind of world they talk about in getting women into politics. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why this hurts women who are present within politics and what they can actually get done. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about male behavior of politicians and explain why that is also bad. Briefly, our stance, and then some responses to the previous speakers. So the stance in opposition, I think, is reasonably clear, right? We support equality, or like pushing for greater fairness within political systems. But we support that not around ideas of essentialization or particular characteristics that should be attributed individually to men or to women. Rather, we support it around ideas that, number one, women and men can both achieve anything, have individual characteristics that should not be tied to their gender. And secondly, the idea that, potentially there has been great unfairness to women in the past, and that's what needs to be overcome in order to get them into power. We reject all of those kind of narratives that say we should attribute particular things to either group. So, secondly, let's talk about responses to the previous speaker. 3 things. Firstly, the idea that women just are, in general, more, pacifistic, more cooperative, less conflict-based. Firstly, I'm going to suggest that in lots of cases, we just might reject this, right? Insofar as often we think those are socially constructed ideas that are already somewhat present, that this is not what women are, but rather the way they ought to behave in male-dominated worlds. Lots of this tying into the stuff they talk about women being seen as homemakers, right? I think we should push away from those narratives and often believe it's not true. But secondly, and more importantly, right, even taking them at their best and assuming it's true that more women in politics is good for that reason, I mean, lots of other reasons why it might be good as well. Obviously, the important part of this case to prove is why more of this happens. This is their second point. So the analysis here goes, people will be more likely to put women into political science courses, for example, because they think it is important to solve conflict. Few responses here. Number 1, potentially true facts from closing opposition. No idea whether that's the case, but that would seem to undermine that case quite a lot. Secondly, I would suggest that they gave no explanation for how this affects any of the barriers after people enter university. So even if it's true that, say, some people want their children to help solve conflict in the world, they give no analysis as to why that would help, for example, in political party structures, where often the greatest barriers to women lie. But thirdly, and most importantly, right, they say this is changing the narrative around women, but give no explanation of what that narrative is in the first place. I'm going to explain why the very narratives that they're talking about are what shut women out of politics in the long run. So, firstly, let's talk about why we think we get fewer female politicians in general, in important positions, in parties, full stop, and lots of those things. 4 reasons why we think it is the case that often more people will reject these ideas and not want their politicians to represent cooperation and a lack of conflict than those who actually support those kind of things. Number 1, I would suggest that some people just want more kind of toughness, violence, somebody who is willing to stand up to things than somebody who is willing to cooperate and communicate, right? So notice, this doesn't necessarily mean that they can't get things done. I think Donald Trump is a prime example of this, right? Opening government point out, we've seen a push towards more conflict within the world, more conflict from politicians. I suggest that reflects people wanting those things to be represented. Somebody who says, I will draw a hard line here and not push any further, right? They need to explain why fewer of those people exist than more. Secondly, I'd note that increasingly in the Western world, at the very least, right, politics is becoming highly partisan. And within that framework, somebody who says, I will work with the opposite party, actually becomes an anathema to their party, right? That's what happened with the Tea Party, where you saw a ton of moderate Republicans being branded as rhinos and not being able to let into the government. Thirdly, I would suggest structurally, lots of people end up deciding their positions on things, if it's not just rawly partisan and they are caring about issues, on a few particular issues, right? And what is more important to them in those circumstances is not somebody who says, I can get a broad range of go back and forth across the board, but rather somebody who says, I will stand up for this particular thing. I will not let you down. I will be the person who does not compromise on those things. Given that characterization, I say there are more people who are more likely to want somebody with that kind of narrative than somebody who's cooperative, right? Perhaps most importantly, I'll take you in 1 second. I suggest this ties into explicitly the very kind of narratives that shut women out of politics at the moment, right? Ideas around weakness, ideas around women not being tough enough. Given that those things are the current barrier to entering politics in the most part, we suggest adopting a narrative that can be twisted by your opponents to say, yeah, they are somebody who cooperates. They are somebody who gives in on certain issues. They're somebody who is weak, somebody who is not tough enough for you. I think that is a weapon that should not be handed to them. Go ahead.
So you never told us why people wanting stronger politicians is necessarily a good suggestion that this is a good policy, but you're telling the reason they want it is because it's been colored by sexism.
Yeah, no, but my point is, you get to change the narrative around women. You don't get to change how people think about politics, right? So insofar as that is still how their mindset operates, you can't just fiat in that suddenly they like these things as well as them being present in the world. What are the impacts of those things? I think at various structural levels across politics, this hurts women's ability to access power. It hurts at the voting level when voters are thinking, actually, I'm not somebody who will stand up for them. It hurts at party selection level when people who are deciding who's going to be the next MP that I try and bring on board thinks, this is really not somebody who's going to toe the particular line on my issues, who'll stand behind me on these particular things. But it also hurts at the level of things like bill sponsorship, where, again, that reputation for being somebody who actually will cooperate, who will give way along lots of those things is going to hurt you. We think that flips the biggest claim, indeed the only claim so far, from opening government, and therefore we are at the very least beating them straight off the bat. Secondly, let's talk about why this hurts the ability of female politicians to do politician-y things, right? At the point where you are elected on a particular basis of, namely, I'm a cooperator, I'm somebody who always gives and takes, and those sorts of things, you are bound to that narrative going on into the future. So note, this already happens within politics to an extent. If you have a reputation for being really good at economics, it's expected that if an economic crisis comes up, you'll handle it really well, and you will be punished accordingly if you fail to do this. Why is this particularly bad in this instance, though? Because it's not a particular policy that you're being tied to by your voters and by whoever put you into power. Rather, it is a structural way of behaving that in some cases will not be the best stance to take. So it means that, for example, if you do end up in a situation where it is best to stand tough and say, I will not cooperate, the voter base who elected you on the basis of they are a cooperator, they negotiate over these things, means you are likely to lose support for those things. That structurally means female politicians cannot take the best avenues because they are bound across a whole range of things to act in a particular way. Lastly, we suggest the flip side is true for men. Insofar as women are the ones who take up the cooperative roles, men are more expected to be those who stand tough on those issues. Again, sometimes not the best strategy to take. Ultimately, we reject essentializing narratives across the board because they bind people to those particular behaviors, but more importantly, because they just stop us from helping women in the first place. Proud to oppose.
I thank leader up, and I invite them to turn this.
Ready? The case from OG was very simple, but was misconstrued by the O. We tell you that the ceiling in the status quo for better policies and conflict resolutions is oftentimes limited because people on the ground are colored. People on the ground are colored by the image that these are the best policies that they can achieve. We think all your problems get solved in the moment in which, unfortunately for us, that women start coming to the forefront, start suggesting alternatives, and they start working. Maybe then you can achieve the things that we need in the world today. Okay, what did they tell us? They said equality can be achieved because there is a way in which we can negate negative stereotypes. We tell you that oftentimes, unfortunately, and I think the problem with the op bench as a whole is very first world centric. We agree, maybe in LSE and Oxford, that women dominate majority fields in political science. We don't think that is the truth around the world. So if we can even get marginal benefits in most other countries that aren't in LSE and Oxford, we think that that is far preferential because we think sexist narratives still exist. Push forward this narrative because we tell you there are three key structural barriers, especially in most ways around the world, that the narratives works against women. Because in the mind of the average male, women are weaker. We need to push the idea that women are stronger. What are these barriers? For example, the idea that women get periods and are more likely to push nuclear buttons is pretty, unfortunately persuasive in lots of Muslim countries. We find that regrettable. There's also sexist narratives that blind men, that the fact that women will always suggest weaker things, like the op suggests, it is problematic. So we tell you, what do we want and how are we able to achieve this? It's a very simple number scheme. So if you have more participation in politics, we suggest to you that there'll be better discourse. Because unfortunately, due to structural barriers, some women aren't able to flag out the ideas in which they can potentially improve the political status quo. And you lock those women out. Let me negate the harms that the OG bring to us. Number one, that they want, people want toughness, and people people oftentimes want strong-arm politicians, and that is problematic. So we tell you, they will only want this as long as it's working, and the only reason it's working is because of sexism. If you're able to include more women, and if you give more women chances to actually have proper deals and a more holistic political society, we think we change the world in which we view how politics should be. If there is more conflict resolution, if there's more deals actually working out in the benefit, that is when you change the narrative. So their argument falls a short, as politics will always be a certain way. We think that is problematic because the certain way is a feeling that has been hampering our ability to go further. Secondly, we tell you that not always will women be weaker, right? We think cooperation oftentimes also means that if you can structurally make your country better, more countries are able to cooperate with you. So we don't think that it's necessary for OG to take on the burden that women will always concede to things. We think that women will always make worse deals. So I'll tell you why later, which is a structural analysis that Nicholas gave you. But lastly, what did he say? We changed the narrative. So this is where we have a two-pronged argument. If we change the narrative that women are better in politics, we think that it's some form of repatriation, because the narratives are already true in status quo. The people already consider women a very, very acceptable to do important things like be nurses and be doctors and be teachers, right? Predominantly. Why? Because they're caring individuals who care for people on the ground. We think we need to heighten the narrative to actually support them in accessing job spectrums that are allowed to impact a lot more people. How will we achieve this world, right? By 5 key things, right? We are happy for history books to highlight the success of women. We would rather show more trends of women being successful, like individuals like Angela Merkel, and we continue shitting on men. We're happy with this. We're happy to shove this narrative down the throat and color the opinions of people on the ground to be more favorable towards women. I think that is something we can fear. What else would this lead to? I think majority in the third world, at least there's more likelihood of fathers sending their daughters to school because they believe that they can actually go into politics, that they can actually change things, that women on the ground actually feel empowered by their state, or at least another state supporting this sort of narratives. Lastly, we are even happy with tricking people on the ground to believe that women politics are better. Like we're happy to suggest like a huge range of policies and have people suggest or select which is the most favorable. Then after they select the most favorable, we'll be like, haha, it was actually suggested by a woman and the rest was suggested by men. We're happy with all these things because they help shape the narrative in which we already view women in the status quo. Why are we okay with this, and why do we think our outcomes are more likely to happen, right? Firstly, we would suggest that this is the key premise of our argument, that oftentimes a disproportionate amount of people that could have been very successful in politics are being locked out due to structural barriers, right? What does this mean? This means that because you are a woman, you're less likely to get educated. But we would suggest that oftentimes being good in politics has as much as it's due to your biology. The fact that you can have the ability to remain calm during conflict, the ability for you to compress huge amounts of data when deciding certain policies, the ability to always have, like, to introspect what are the necessities of a specific country are oftentimes within the bodies of people. But these people are being locked out on their gender. So we suggest that if you have a larger group of people coming forward with their ideas, or a larger investment in majority of people on the ground to have good ideas, maybe then women would start surfacing to the top. So our contention is not women are better at politics on the basis of them being women. Our contention is these individuals were always going to be good at politics anyway, but in the status quo they're constantly being locked out, and that is why we are constantly in conflict. That if, like for example, right, like if you had more teams in Whoop It, then maybe the finals debate would be far better, right, and far more competitive because there are a lot more individuals to compete at this. But we tell you in the status quo, like Whoop It is particularly small, you might not have the best debate possible. So maybe the team that wins can claim, I won Whoop It, boo-hoo for you, but you're not the best in the world, especially when you structurally locked out other teams that are going to come here, but maybe because they're from Israel, they couldn't come to Malaysia, right? Those are structural barriers that we target and we aim to dissolve, that you will constantly have. So yes, you might be the best team at Whoop It, but that means jack shit when there's actually teams out there that were much better than you, and these are the teams that we're more likely to bring. Go, OG.
Yeah,
Sorry.
So yeah, you explain that the structural barriers women face are often tied to ideas of being weak and not tough enough. Can you explain for the first time how this narrative helps to break down those stereotypes?
Correct, because being weak is considered bad. If we start telling people maybe not being weak though, but being more open to suggestions and being more open to negotiations, and if it has proper policies that oftentimes leads to the betterment of people on the ground, maybe, just maybe, people would think that women deserve a place in politics. Because we tell you that the reason why we think these things are such is because it is a man's world out there, and that is absolutely disgusting. So what we need is more women at the forefront, because more women on the forefront mean more ideas in a discussion. When more ideas happen, people have to compete with the best of ideas. When there's more competition, better policies are oftentimes passed. If better policies are oftentimes passed, people on the ground are significantly happier. That is how this is very simple mathematics in general, right? Like more people oftentimes lead to better things, right? And if we prove to you that there are a huge group of women, especially in the third world, that are being locked up because of sexist narratives or being locked up because of structural barriers, and we bring them to the forefront and allow them to improve politics, we take this debate.
I'm going to concede two things. The first thing I'm going to concede explicitly is that if it is a good thing to say nice things about women, to do blind political tests, empower women in general, that's not mutually exclusive. We would like to do that as well. The second thing I'm going to concede is it's probably true whoever wins Whoopit isn't the best team in the world. The Worlds is coming up in a few weeks. Hopefully there'll be a more accurate reference point. What we are not going to concede is that this government bench does absolutely anything to put women in a better position. Without any trace of arrogance and just in purely empirical terms, I do think this top half debate is over in about 1.5 minutes, and I'll explain why. The reason for that is simple. This government's bench says, we want more women in power because when they're in power, they can do good things for the world. We asked, is this actually true? I mean, it seems a bit essentialist and a bit dubious. We want to give them that assumption. Let's assume it is true. How do you get more women into positions of power? That's the thrust of Louis' case and the nuance that they've completely missed. Because our case isn't that women don't deserve to be there. Our case is that you need to fool men or people in general, women who have been indoctrinated to learn helplessness, into thinking that women will make the best fighters possible, even if they are not in fact going to act in that way. That's why Louis tells you that it is simply empirically untrue that people want cooperation or to reduce conflict. They do not want less tribalism, division, or polarization. They do not want someone who will not be seen as fighting for your everyday interests in the battlefield that is Parliament or Congress. And the response to all these arguments was to say, no, thank you, if you give women a chance, they will change people's minds about what is politically preferable. Precisely. On our side of the house, we give them the opportunity because, like in any political situation, we campaign on the basis of one platform, but once we are in power, prove that we can do a good job on the basis of a separate political strategy that is effective. It's unfortunate that democracies have to rely on a degree of deception in this way, but I think that if we've shown you this degree of deception, i.e. catering to what people and the electorate currently want, gets us closer there, this is a clash we win. So, to be clear, we win the clash about political participation at every level. We win the argument that says more people will vote for women because they perceive women to be as good as fighting for their interests. We win the clash that says parties will nominate more women because they're not afraid they will one day sell out on the battle floor. We win the clash that says women will be more coalition partners or sponsors of bills because they are not afraid, and men are not afraid they will sell out when it comes to negotiating as opposed to fighting for these things. We get women into positions of power they want. We achieve these benefits. We win the top half. So thank you. Bits of new material before some responses. The new claim we're going to advance is that it might be good, going to give this concession, that conflict is unnecessary in politics, but there are other areas in which conflict is necessary, and these are high-powered areas that women care about. I do not think it is worth the trade-off to set women's progress back in these areas at the expense of progress here. What do these areas look like? I think it's things like the boardroom, where corporate governance is often seen as a battle with shareholders against corporate interests, against the CEOs and CFOs for control of a company. It is things like in court, where in the most confrontational setting known to man, two big, well, apart from debating possibly, two big squads of people come together and say, yeah, let's screw the hell out of that guy and show that he's lying. Again, kind of similar to debate, I suppose. But also in the domestic sphere, where women are expected to stand up increasingly for their own interests. No, thank you. Two things happen. The first thing happens when politicians, female politicians, justify using the rhetoric that this government bench supports their political stances. So they try and justify why they as a woman are better at being cooperative than any other male candidate in order to get into power. I suspect it's a lot of the same rhetoric that the Prime Minister used to say, because of our position of weakness, we are more likely to be able to amenably negotiate and listen to what other people care about. This creates a lot of learned helplessness in women in other areas who then internalize these narratives and think there is something essential about their biology or their upbringing or their history that means they must act this way. It means that when a man interviews them and says, why are you cut out for this board role? They're going to have to lie, or they will feel like they are lying when they say, I will do as good a job. They will feel like they are lying. No, thank you. When they interview for Harvard Law School and they are asked, why can you be as good a district attorney as this other male candidate? That's a terrible thing insofar as we want women on our side of the house to be empowered to have more opportunities going forward. Not right now. The second thing that happens is a rollback of existing policies that was designed to help women bridge those structural obstacles, things like getting into law school or things like affirmative action quotas. Why? Because the social justification for policies matters as well. People who seek to remove these policies are increasingly critical, will take all quotations of feminist leaders who defended these things. And no, thank you, not right now. The justifications that were used at the time were not essentialist, i.e., we did not, in an attempt to have more quotas in the Supreme Court, for example, say women will make more compassionate attorneys or prosecutors. The argument there was women are just as ferocious as men. They will do just as good a job putting criminals behind bars. And at the point where these narratives at so many levels in society, in the developing world and the developed world, start to be reversed at the political level, i.e. the level at which most legislative change happens, these justifications get knocked down and undermined at a far higher rate. A lot of these things which are already being rolled back in the status quo, like in Trump's America, are just going to be rolled back even further. I'll take closing if they still have one. Opening.
They lie in the status quo because women are forced to behave more like men to enter the political sphere, and oftentimes they're locked to a particular set of traits. Don't you think changing that is far better?
Okay, I'm gonna, at best, right, you're saying that in the absence of this narrative, there will be an equal and opposite one. So if in either side of the house, they're locked to act one way or the other, I mean, just, it seems like a harm either way. On our side of the house, at the very least, they are in power, they are meaningfully participating at every level, and they can, in other areas on the comparative, do more of these good things. So what is the upshot of this argument? The upshot is, when it doesn't come just to politics, but the many other things that women care about in their lives, we get more participation as well as a result of the things that we preserve. Last bit of stuff that Louis tells you that doesn't get a response, but I think you have to weigh up in the clash against all the teams because it's beefies. Female politicians get hamstrung if they semi-run on a cooperation ticket, because at the point where that becomes the perception of voters when they select you explicitly, as opposed to your expertise in any one area, it is harder to stand tough and do the opposite, knowing that the political costs you will bear the next election are higher than any other candidate who ran on a more generic or even a pro-family platform. The difference between a pro-family platform, by the way, and this one is a pro-family platform affects a small set of issues. This one affects, literally all of them. That's what Louis meant when he said it was a structural issue. Some final strands of rebuttal. I mean, if it is OG are right that there's too much conflict and women create less conflict, I just don't think we can actually credit this argument about reducing conflict being a good thing, because they've never actually shown women are, in fact, empirically more pliant and more cooperative. It's just sort of a psycho assertion that they've made. But more importantly, this benefit only comes about, this change of perceptions about how female politicians will conduct their affairs. This only comes about as a benefit if previously the electorate thought women were conflict heavy and now they've changed their minds. I'm just not sure that change has happened either. It's not like in the past, people thought female politicians were super high on conflict, and now when we take that away, it'll change perceptions in a way that meaningfully affects their voting patterns. Upshot of all of this, way more women in politics, way better engagement, and just sort of better for women in society as a whole. Very proud to oppose.
I thank you. On behalf of staff, on behalf of
I will be doing two things in my speech. First, I'll prove to you why we get more female politicians in the world, or we create a narrative against conflict, and why this is particularly important in where women are most vulnerable, which are conflict societies or conflict-ridden societies and post-conflict societies. So even if we lose the long-term debate about them, this is the most important value and we still win this debate. But secondly, I'll talk about the long-term and why this narrative still empowers women later on. So first, on the short term, we agree with opening opposition. OG never proved to us how you'll have more female politicians, so we will do it right now. Why is it most likely that we'll have more female politicians? Note first and foremost that analysis that we heard coming from opening opposition was very, very Western-centric. They said in Western liberal democracies, most people are pro-war or pro-conflict, and that's why we will not get their votes. We think where this narrative is the most important, which is conflict societies, most people are averse to having war. Most people are averse to having conflict like this in society. And there are reasons for this. One, because war necessarily ruins the lives of everyone who are there. No, thank you. But secondly, it ruins their jobs and ruins all economic opportunities that they're able to have. Which means that, especially after a war has taken place, after a conflict situation has taken place, most people don't want to enter back into that conflict and want peace. So the popular opinion is to go against war and be pacifist. No, thank you. We then think if we intertwine that with the narrative that women are more likely to be pacifist and cooperative, and that's how we're able to get the kind of elections and the kind of popularity we want to be able to have. But secondly, even if this debate is about Western liberal democracies, I think it was highly asserted coming from opening opposition as to why they're more predisposed to fighting conflict, or why they're most predisposed to fighting, like electing politicians who want to fight for their interests. Because even the most firebrand example that we heard coming from them, which is Donald Trump, tries to pacify himself and doesn't want to enter into conflict to begin with. So we don't understand why there's a predisposition to be going against conflict anyway. But even if we win Western liberal democracies, I'll prove to you why these conflict-ridden societies is most important. The fourth one, sure, open it. Oh, close it then.
Okay, so given that in post-conflict societies, the main leaders are people who have fought in the war and revolutionaries, women have structural barriers why they'll never get that resume. So women on your side will always be disadvantaged in politics.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's a good part, right? Because if we take men as the reasons for the conflict, and most people in society are averse to entering into conflict, then we think you increase the popularity of women. That's why a lot of times in post-conflict societies, that's when women were able to rise into power because they're the ones perceived to be supporting the rest of the family, protecting peace. So why is this a good thing, right? Given that you have more women who are likely to be politicians, that means you have more likely to get legislation that protects women from the kinds of harms of conflict. Things like being able to reduce conflict, like things like being able to lobby against conflict to begin with, which then allows women to be disproportionately harmed, right? We think the likely scenario is, in any conflict around the world, women are most likely to be harmed and disproportionately harmed by their policies. And there are reasons to believe this. First, because they're more likely to be targeted things like sexual slavery, for instance, or being used as objects of war and spoils of war altogether. But secondly, because women are socialized into positions where they don't know how to defend themselves. Things like them not being able to be trained in arms, or them being forced to take care of the family, take care of their children, so they're not able to defend themselves as well. At the very least, when we're able to lobby for reduction of conflict, then we're able to increase things like diplomacy, which protects women's interests. No, thank you. But secondly, even if we're not able to reduce conflict altogether, we think it increased protections for women if we put women in positions of power, because as they said, they're likely to fight for things like cooperation and protection. Things like making more likely to defend women and increasing lobbying for reparations allowed to protect women's interests. What we would suggest coming from closing government is that we want women to have female positions of power to reduce the worst harms, atrocities. Before I move on, sure.
Actually, I saw that in post-conflict societies, there's a desire to be ready when the next conflict comes about. That's why you see so much things like militias not refusing to disarm, because there's great suspicion of other groups that just 2 years ago fought the war against you. This flips your case.
Okay. So there's a distinction between saying that you want to be ready for war, but secondly, being predisposed to the war in the instance where you're able to fight. This motion doesn't tell us that women have to never enter into conflict. What we would suggest is, the likely scenario is that instead of entering into conflict immediately when there's miscommunication between states, you're likely to negotiate first and you cooperate as well, and then only enter conflict in the worst case. So why is this argument the most important argument in today's debate? Note that in conflict societies where women are pushed to the most vulnerable nature, we would suggest that this is where the help or the fight for women is the most important, because this is where their lives are being taken away. But secondly, we would suggest that even if they win the long-term debate, we don't understand, it is at best a speculative benefit that we're able to change the narratives in the long term, but at the very least in the short term, we're able to win. But even if we don't get women in positions of power, what we would suggest is the narrative that they are cooperative instead of combatant means that it's more likely for us to get the justification and political capital to condemn atrocities that target women because of the perception that the women aren't part of the reasons for the conflict to begin with. So what we would suggest is that at the very least we're able to protect women even if they get positions of power. But second, right? Because even if this debate ought to be assessed from long term, why is it better on the other side house? So their claim is that you reinforce stereotypes that women are weak. We would suggest that it is the same kind of problem or same possible harm as things in other forms of affirmative action policies. I understand the DLO tried to differentiate it by saying the narrative of quotas that women are equally ferocious but are not capable, but the very nature that you give them automatic positions of power means that you recognize that they're structurally disadvantaged and they need the kind of help from the state to be able to help them. We would suggest that it is the same thing coming from our side of the house, because we're able to recognize that women are put in positions of power, are put in positions of vulnerability, and we need to be able to help them. But why are we okay with things of affirmative action, even if they might have this backlash in terms of perception of women? Because there are things that are more important than initial perception or believing that women are weak or vulnerable. The more important battle for women right now isn't to prove that they're going to be bad politicians, but rather to prove that there can be politicians to begin with. What we would suggest coming from closing government, is that when you create that narrative and allow them to get the kind of popularity necessary to align themselves with interests in states, at the very least we're able to create a narrative that they can be politicians. This leads to multiple outcomes. outcomes. First, it means that other women who learned helplessness and not want to be politicians to begin with realize that they are also capable of being politicians and if you're able to change. So even in the short term where they reinforce these notions of like domesticism and like submission, in the long term, you're able to start changing this because you have increased the number of women and inherently you'll have increased the diversity of their views, which means that it's far more likely for us to get representative women who also want to fight for the things that they want to have for on their side of the house as well. So what is the conclusion in this debate? Even if they win the long term, we've proven to you why the short term is more important. But secondly, even if this debate is about the long term, we win it also in closing government. We're very proud to go to the finals. Thanks.
What's missing in the debate is a discussion about women who do end up getting into politics. What happens to them when they discuss in Congress? What happens to their ideas? What happens to the policies they stand for? What happens to the overall electorate, considering that politicians who are female also affect other individuals who aren't female? Therefore, closing opposition will focus on a broader perspective. That is to say, incapacitating women in politics necessarily affects not only women, but people on the ground whose lives literally depend on their opinions and policy stances. But before that, let's deal with a few things coming from closing government. Firstly, they try to picture this debate into post-conflict and very conveniently ignore the Western context and say, well, there are more harms, therefore it must be the most important context in this debate. I think it's a few problems with this. In order to first tell us why it's important in an important context, more so than the majority of cases which will apply to liberal democracies, they must tell us why this one narrative is the overwhelming narrative that will change the perception of individuals on women on the ground. They concede these are post-conflict societies with a myriad of problems regarding women, and those perceptions are dominated by things like religion or staunch patriarchy. Why is this one particular narrative going to make any significant impact? We posit is untrue. Because if anything, even if they might be the most vulnerable individuals, their benefits are extremely marginal, making them not an important context. But even if that is true, and this is really important, I just don't buy that this is necessarily an argument that works for women in these areas. These are literally countries born out of conflict. That is to say, like, in order to get out of the, in order to be a post-conflict nation, is necessarily a result of, say, long years of revolution, etc. This perception that female politicians are inherently cooperative and conflict averse is antithetical to the idea that females can be revolutionaries, leaders of a political movement that took out the dictatorship. That means necessarily that women are incapable of being the same part of the same movement who necessarily took out that particular oppressor. But the second reason why it doesn't work for women is because in post-conflict societies, it isn't just about avoiding war. I think they took conflict in a literal sense. Like, in many cases, you actually need hardline individuals to expel political remnants of pre-conflict dictatorships. Like, you need strong politicians to say no to certain policies which are reminiscent of, like, Mubarak or even Muammar Gaddafi. And the absence of the proliferation of perception that women are unable to force that policy away is necessarily something that hurts them in the run-up to elections too. So, like, I think there are many reasons opening up gay gun and POI why women can't survive in these within this narrative post-conflict societies, but at best their benefit is a wash and ignores a lot of the benefits we talk about in Western liberal democracies. So let's talk about women in politics now. I think it's important to note the context of this debate first, because these are there are necessarily two different types of policies if you look at this debate. There are policies which are conflict averse, no sanctions, policies which may lead to certain conflicts like being hardline or being tough on Russia and North Korea. In all those instances, we think there is no value, there is no inherent value to any of those policies. However, what the value that is important is a value that the discussion that ensues from it. That is to say, why is it that we have to be tough on Russia? Why must we be compromised with North Korea? The value is in the discussion. We would posit that the existence of this narrative stops these discussions from taking place in the most meaningful way. One, because when female politicians bring up policies which may be inherently conflict averse, like proposing not sanctioning Burma for the recent policies or not increasing say military intervention to North Korea, for example, these arguments will be instead framed into the social narrative that women are inherently conflict averse. That is to say, sexist politicians will brand these arguments as a result of the inherency of females being conflict averse, as opposed to the value of these arguments being bad. So what happens then is that discussions in Congress become like poisoned by the perception that, oh look, these policies are just a result of female cooperativeness, as opposed to like them being inherently bad because of X reasons. And I think this drives out a lot of the discussion that can take place politically. But what that means is that this means that necessarily individuals or people from constituents where females represent them lose out, because it means that they're unable to get their policies through, because in like a majority of cases, those opinions, those ideas and those policies get framed into sexism, as opposed to one that is taken down because of its intellectual, incoherency. But before that opening.
Okay, given that, sure, there are two values in politics, conflict and non-conflict, but the conflict-prone genre is dominated by men. Why not give women their own niche in politics? Because I think it's pretty obvious that some people value bipartisanship.
Look. Just because narrative exists doesn't mean all women will buy into this narrative. There will be inherently women who want to choose any political opposition due to a myriad of reasons, be it representing their parliament, etc. And that means inherently, when they do have to make the choice that is antithetical to this narrative, they will get shot down as a result of sexism. That is the point. But secondly, I think more often than not, what is likely to happen as well is that you structurally make them unable to defend bills which are like pro-women, or necessarily in any cases, any bills which are defended by female politicians will likely to be more attacked and more heavily scrutinized by politicians. Why so? Because if they are seen to be very cooperative and conflict averse, that is an opportunity for sexist politicians or other opposing houses to attack them as much as possible. Because the idea is, if you do it hard enough, they have to cave in because they're women and they're cooperative. So some sort of compromise may take place. What this means is that it makes bills forwarded by female politicians more open to attacks unnecessarily, and even more so. And what that means is that we feel that there are more harms. We reduce the ability for them to forward their policies from their constituents. But the third reason is, let's look at imposter syndromes. For the female politicians who get into power with this narrative, that is to say, there's an overwhelming narrative, and the only reason you're told that the only reason why you're in power is that because you rode on the wave of this narrative. That just makes it harder for them to reconcile their own ideas to the reason why they get into power, and that's extremely pernicious their ability to be very vocal or very consistent in any policy they forward, and that's bad. But why are all these inconsistencies problematic? I think the first reason is obviously because it makes for ineffective politics on behalf of females who do get elected. But more importantly, it affects a larger scale of individuals. Compromising the credibility of some opinions means that literally the electorate isn't affected. But where have we seen this? Where have we seen this in real life? The fact is, more women in politics per se isn't an a priori benefit. What's a benefit is if this presence in politics results in more policies which are better for women and people in general. That is why, for example, in Uganda and Malawi, you have a majority of females in their respective congresses, but you don't have the same policies which are reflective of that sort of representation. And the reason, arguably, is because of these sort of narratives, not necessarily this particular narrative, but an overwhelming narrative that boxes women into one particular opinion and one particular line of argumentation. It makes them one-dimensional of being dealt with and one-dimensional of being taken down. And that's why inherently it makes it harder for women to operationalize their version of politics. We're very proud to be the first team that talks about why women are structurally incapable of forwarding policies that benefit everyone as a result of this narrative. Thank you very much.
I thank Member Hall and I invite Douglas.
Before I talk about why the context you provided about developing places, post-conflict places, where culture exists, where we think we can actually get more politicians who are women into power, I'll just deal with their extension right off the bat. First, he says that it's easy to target women now. Once you're in the office, right? Once you're gonna try, for example, make a bill, you're gonna get targeted, no one's gonna agree with you. He didn't really talk about the opposite, the converse. On their side, I think that what's gonna happen is, if you are confrontational or seen as like conflict prone, then people are also going to target you. People won't even actually want to deal with you or want your bill to be passed. But the difference is, under our side, you were actually still in office. So we're proving to you why there are benefits to you actually becoming more likely to be in office. We think we take that point. But second thing he says that in response to our extension, he says three things. First, in this POI, he tells us that most people, Hershey tells us actually that there are most people who will be voted in were revolutionaries, and these people are very popular. To some extent, this is true. But we don't think it is true to the extent that the entire, for example, Congress would be filled with men. Maybe you might, for example, have one revolutionary leader there. But if you look at actually many parties, for example, the ANC, for example, if you look at like quotas for women in Rwanda, that's just not empirically true. And the reason why are like several. First, there are also popular women, for example, who were like keeping things together in the refugee camps, or who are, let's say, the other side of like that patriarchy, i.e. the women leaders in that area, would also be popular. So we think that, sure, religion might be something that might be sexist, but we don't think it is sexist to the degree that it rejects women to be in power to begin with. The more likely characterization is this, that often in these countries, first world feminism isn't very popular. But however, there is, however, a traction to get some women in power. They just believe in gender roles, but it's not to the extent that they want women to be completely slaves of men or something like that. Which is why we think there are popular women in these places. So the comparative now is this: what they want to do is to try and reject this narrative. Reject this narrative, even though that is where most political capital to get some women in power exists, where there is some hope for that to happen. Which is why we think fundamentally they don't win that point by simply asserting that because it was after a revolution, only the revolutionary icons get in. But the second thing they say to us is this, that you want to go into conflict. And you want a strong leader to protect yourself in conflict. And here's where I want to transition to my issue on why this is the most important issue. You didn't respond to the main point of our contention, which is that obviously what happened before this, you're preceded by a dictator, a strong man. There is more like reasons to show why if you would be fed up with anything or any kind of leadership, you'd be fed up with the kind of leader that ran your country to the ground, was responsible, for example, for like the conflict. We think that people will be willing to find someone who is willing to actually not get into a conflict again, and maybe negotiate with, let's say, the other kind of party, or at least keep the negotiations that have happened, which is why we think on that first level, they're unresponsive. But second of all, we also told you that human beings inherently just feel that conflict is really bad, whether it's because of economic reasons and you're the elite, you would still be hurt economically, or if you had relatives who died. That was unresponded to as well. Now, why is it important that we talk about this? First, because at this part of the debate, I'm pretty sure there isn't really any grand, compelling outcome that they've talked about. But we did tell you, however, that it's likely that in these areas at least, women are likely to win. And why do you think it's good that women are in power here? First of all, because given that there's a bias, as I said early on in rebutting them, for women who have to fit these gender roles, the propensity for politicians in general to be not pro-conflict and pro like the kinds of harms that hurt most people here is likely to exist. And given that women tend to be disproportionately affected by conflict, we think it's very good for women. Now I'm going to weigh this up with OG. Sure.
So it's not the case that people just love conflict. Rather, that often they see somebody who is willing to stand up and be conflicting in situations as best protecting their own interests. This is true in all societies, including the ones that you talk about. Okay, but we would rather, though, for example, in the context we talked about, that you wouldn't be that person who supported, let's say, the contrary goal and just try to oppose everyone. Because remember, that POI, right, probably assumes that in these areas, people don't want to get into that conflict. Which is precisely why, if we have this initial critical mass of people who don't even who are predisposed to not having a conflict-ridden society, we create the social narrative, or support the social narrative that ensures no one is going to oppose that, and we have less conflict. Okay, let's not get to liberal democracies contexts like that. We would agree that sure, maybe some people like Trump are very popular. This is the main case you're saying that they're talking about, right? We think that there are two things you have to note here, coming from a logic for extension, that can apply even to this context. The first is this, that there are politicians out there who are somewhat religious, who are somewhat, for example, like the kind of politician who a conservative person would want to vote for. And these people feel that they would vote for them because they fit into, let's say, those kinds of gender roles of being not prone to conflict or anything like that. We think that the outcome for policy still exists even in the liberal context, because there will be women who are more likely to be voted, or let's say the conservative male who fits, let's say, that conflict-ridden kind of, who's also prone to who rejects conflict. So we have a plus under our side as well. So what's important? Because all the harms, all the benefits that OG talked about in the liberal context, having more women politicians existing, can accrue under our side because they provide the link as to why fundamentally, even though
some politicians, some people might be willing to vote for Trump. There are obviously more conservative, for example, women out there who can vote as an option as well. I think that's also very good. But second of all, we think on this whole issue then of like, will women get into like political science or stuff like that? We think that we actually win that issue as well. Because look at it this way, your reason for wanting to get into like, let's say a job that deals with conflict, whether it be policy or diplomacy, isn't reliant on, for example, you coming from, let's say, a country that just feels that you have to be pro-conflict or whatnot. We think that the core values that prevent you from wanting to get into that kind of job or that kind of course are actually tied to like the kinds of things that they don't support under our side. So we think, on balance, right, there will be more women who belong to some societies who will be supportive of them to take that kind of course if that social narrative exists. If you look at the numbers, though, on some, the people who belong to those kinds of contexts, with those kinds of families and whatnot, wouldn't even have that social narrative to back them up. So the net number of people who would even try to get into diplomacy or policy doesn't exist. We're very proud.
I think the good now, I invite final speaker.
As the only female speaker in this room, and actually a political science and international relations major specializing in post-conflict nascent democracies, I can assure you that my stats are broadly accurate, obviously not to the number, but in general representation. 2, that I'm certainly not going to hold my punches when I take down Gov's case. And 3, that I don't think my credibility as a speaker is hurt by this either. Arguably, I can tell you that female speakers and female politicians can equally be effective. But here's the difference. I can tell you also when sometimes trade-offs are worth willing to make. I can also tell you where the comparative is. And I can also tell you how do we get to the best middle ground in this debate in order to tell you to win. And the reason for this is there's no social narrative that tells me that if I must be either negotiatory or conflict-driven. Because it is my ability to decide what is best to operationalize out of my identity that makes me the most effective speaker that I can be. And that is what allows female politicians to be the most effective female politicians, to stand for their electorate, to stand up for their policies and propose them successfully, to not get shot down and just keep quiet as they get attacked in Congress. And that's what allows female politicians to do the job that we entrust them to do, to represent women on the ground, but also represent people that they care about and be an example for why women deserve to be here. Arguably on their side, they reduce the efficacy of female politicians, no thanks, not just as women, as representatives of their gender, but also as politicians, and therefore makes everybody's lives worse on their side. 2 things in my speech. Firstly, how this affects the kind of policies that we make, and secondly, how this affects women running for politics. So how does this affect the kind of policies we make? One bit of framing, right? The primary function of a politician is to propose policies and determine what best policies there are. Razzaq told you why this allows women to have better abilities to propose policies, why this allows them to defend those policies, and allows you to have the discussion for you to be able to talk about the justifications for policies so that it's a good decision at the end of the day. They never dealt with the decision-making process and how that's necessarily hurt when you have less discussion because you think it's easy to shut women down. But also they never deal with the fact, no thanks, that because I think that a woman is an easy target, they A, attacked, B, will never be chosen to front policies because you know their policies are going to be more vulnerable, no thanks, and C, that you put the burden on women in a disproportionate way to have to front that kind of political attack and opposition against them. Note that lots of these attacks are very nasty, no thanks. Note that lots of these put an undue amount of pressure for women to prove why they have to be there rather than be entitled to be there and speak in front of a crowd because they are politicians. I think that this far greater hurts the kind of credibility that you have of female politicians. Buying into harms, no thanks, that opening government told you was the case. That if the opening government want to impact, that you want to increase the credibility of women politicians, I think that you hurt them. them more. I think the closing government dropped the ball when their only response, and their biggest response, is that we don't have a comparative. So let's just spend like a minute telling you what exactly the comparative is, right? I think the problem is that Gov assumes that structural barriers remain as they are in status quo, and that like nothing happens to take them down. That's just not true, right? You can look at status quo and see why change is already happening, no thanks, in terms of female politicians, right? Like look at like the amount of female politicians that are just being represented in today's world. We have Julia Gillard, right? We have Theresa May, but you also have notably women that are hardline and in places like to do with foreign affairs and stuff like that. Right? You have like Susan Rice, you have Condoleezza, you have like Sarah Palin, all notable hardliners and people who are like quite tough on these issues. No thanks. So I think that there is some kind of empirical proof that women are really like in politics, even to some extent, even if not to a majority extent. But there are also like recent events that have mean that women are increasing in number. So you have things like the Nasty Women campaign, no thanks. You have the kind of anger that comes about from the women's marches. That means that women are increasingly like coalescing and mobilizing within politics, right? Look at the like recent American congressional elections, where like a notable amount of women and trans people, non-binary people, like have been elected into office from the pressure, the leftover pressure from the women's march, because they have the organizational structures, capacities, and the platform to be able to argue for themselves and be angry about things, because women are predominantly angry by the incredibly sexist precedent we have in the United States White House. If these are reasons why we think organic change can happen. But even if you don't buy that organic change can happen, here's another comparative of why we're willing to trade off those things, less women being in office in order to have like necessarily more successful women, right? Because even by OG's own metric, no thanks, of the role model effect, we argue that like the only way to get there is to have successful like female politicians. So note that no thanks, all of Gov assumes that once you're in office, you're suddenly going to be successful. You're suddenly going to stay in office. You're going to remain popular and be able to effect change. That is actually all contingent on your ability to enact change within office. Otherwise, you get seen as a puppet. You get seen as a seat warmer, right? You get seen as somebody that's just there for the minority quota and then gets voted out the next time because your electorate has lost their belief in you because you never stood up for them. This is why Razzaq's extension is the most important thing, because it provides you the mechanism through which, even though you have less women in office, you can get the more role model effect that OG wanted to build for us in order to get more women in office the next time around. But no, this also makes necessarily like women on their side of the world less competitive, because if you never are able to get the benefits we give you about being able to have effective policy change, you never get the kind of CV and resume that you need for re-election. You can never say, I did this, right? Because A, you get less change, but B, even if you get change, I'll take you after this point, even if you get change on your side that's predicated on like negotiations, that is much harder to claim credit for, rather than say, I stuck to my guns, that is why you should fund me as a super PAC, that is why you should give me your votes as a voter, because I will protect you. There's a much better claim to why you should get voted in. I'll take opening.
We told you that it's unfortunate that oftentimes women don't speak their minds in policy boardrooms because they are forced to echo the male majority. We change that. How do you do it?
No, because when you're concessionary and you're negotiating, you end up echoing the majority, because that's how you get the negotiation to work. You need buy-in from the rest of your male colleagues who are incredibly sexist and don't really care about you. It's much better when you're able to have your own voice. Okay, second thing, how this affects women running for politics, right? Talked about why this trade-off necessarily less important, but let's actually deal with the context given to us in closing Gov and show you why they're out of this debate. So look, their premise is that people don't like conflict as much. People are pacifist. I think that's untrue, right? At the point where, for example, in Colombia, like people, like there's a huge referendum to reject peace deals and go back to conflict. I argue that people are just more predisposed to wanting conflict because that allows them to stand up for their rights. That allows them to get the gains that they think are important. It's not like female politicians being in office can change the way that we perceive what is important to us. Why is this the case? Because female politicians being in office still don't affect the people on the ground that are mobilizing and taking up arms and are actually going to fight for what they care about, especially because if they think that you are not fighting for what they care about, they will do it themselves. And that's when less women get to office, but that's when office also gets less important on your side to effect any kind of change. We argue that the most important thing on this side of the house is allowing you to have effective female politicians who are able to stand up for who they believe in and what they believe in. And for those reasons, I'm so proud to oppose.
And results will be announced at the hall.